Well, hello again, and I'm still dealing with the Acts of the Apostles. This week, just out of interest, I'm into I think it's the NIV version. Normally, I prefer to stick to the authorized. It's one I grew up with, but unfortunately, there's so many different versions. I prefer to stick to something which is a little bit more consistent. Anyway. So we're into Acts chapter 12, and this is, to me, an extremely interesting chapter. I may have difficulty in dealing with it in the time, because it starts off and following on from Peter's experiences in chapter 11, which, of course, was that he must take the gospel to the Gentiles, not just this is the vision that he had of the unclean animals on the sheet. But now, because at the end of chapter 11 it says, during this time some prophets came from Jerusalem, Antioch, and they're prophesying a famine in the Roman world, which actually did happen. And so then it comes back into Jerusalem. This is quite interesting as we get on as to where this was taking place, because King Herod, in verse 1 of chapter 12, was arresting some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. Well, that's what was happening. If you... People don't like to think that they're being persecuted now, and Christians are. I've been persecuted, but the fact is that that was the position in the early church. And it's not only persecution, but it says in verse 2, he had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword, so he killed him. And in verse 3, when he saw that this pleased the Jews, I mean, this is quite incredible, because Herod is not just acting on his own initiative, and later on we'll deal with who Herod is, but the fact is that he's not only arresting Christians to persecute, he's now killed James, the brother of John, and because the Jews liked that, he proceeded to arrest Peter. And makes one wonder what would have happened to Peter. I mean, as the story goes on, it doesn't deal with what might have happened, but I have a strong suspicion that he would probably have killed Peter, particularly after what happened in the previous chapter. So, this happened during the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and after the matter of arresting him, as we see in verse 4, he put him in prison, handed him over to the guards. And this is where the NIV gives a clear description of what happened. He was to be guarded by 4 squads, each containing 4 soldiers. That's 16. And I would assume they did it in rotation. And the purpose that Herod had was that he would, at the end of the Passover, Easter, nowadays, that he would bring Peter out and put him on public trial. Now, let me just briefly say, this Herod is also the Herod that took part in the trial of Jesus himself, but more about that later, because there were 2 Herods, Herod the Great and Herod Antipas. So, in verse 5, Peter was kept in prison, and the church was earnestly praying to God for him. It doesn't tell us exactly what they were praying. And of course, this is very important to me because, as most of you will know, I myself was put in a communist prison for preaching the gospel in 1972, which is more than 50 years ago, 52 years ago. And I was arrested for Bible smuggling, but also for preaching the gospel, and the content of the Bible was in question. So I understand what's happening. He's in prison, going to be brought on trial. I was put on trial. Yes, of course I was. And while they couldn't prove most of the accusations against me, and significantly, they couldn't even prove that I was smuggling, but that you have to read the book to find out about that. I was finally condemned on the content of the Bible, which attacks the state. Anyway, verse 5, Peter's kept in prison, the church are praying. And as I'm saying, it doesn't say what they were praying. I would assume they were praying that Peter's life would be spared, that God would give him courage in the trial, which was going to come in a few days. But, verse 6, the night before Herod was to bring him out of the prison and put him on trial, Peter, and I want you to look very carefully at this. It says in verse 6, Peter was sleeping between two soldiers, and he was bound with two chains, I believe one on each hand or arm. And it says that sentries stood guard at the entrance, but more than that, because we also know that he was between two soldiers bound by chains. So he was held by the soldiers and also sentries at the entrance. That would possibly account for 4. When the angel of the Lord appeared and a light shone in the cell, the angel struck Peter on his side, waking him up and saying, "Quick, get up." He did, and the chains fell off Peter's wrists. That's quite interesting, isn't it? Because he's chained between two soldiers. He also has guards at the door. But when he gets up with the angel's command, the chains fell off. And it appears that the soldiers weren't aware that it was happening. This is, to me, having been in prison and all things like this, I find this is fascinating. And so in verse 8, the angel said to him, "Put on your clothes and your shoes." Peter did. And then he's wrapped a cloak around you and follow me. I would assume that in the prison, he certainly didn't have many clothes on, nor did I. I know what it was like, and coming out he would, because this is not particularly warm weather, he would want to have a coat. And the angel said, "Follow me." And in verse 9, Peter followed him out of the prison, but he had no idea what the angel was doing. He had no idea. At this point, he simply thought that he was dreaming, saw a vision. And it's quite interesting because I actually did have a very significant dream or vision when I was in prison, because after I'd only been in for 4 months and just after my trial, I actually had a clear vision of the day that I would be released.